Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Tonight's episode is on the very long-awaited and long-promised subject of prisons for profit. Now, I've talked about this for so long, about so many different podcasts, and I've said I need to do a podcast on this so you guys kind of understand what I'm talking about when I say prison for profit. But before I start talking about that, would you please take a moment if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. Obviously, if you're watching this somewhere else, please obviously refer the video, the podcast to other people, and send them over to YouTube. I mean, YouTube has some pretty great some content, even if you don't include my content. You can like and subscribe my podcast and keep up with me there. Now, before I go on with the topic of today's episode, I do want to take a moment to visit something from the last podcast, which was on the subject of illicit drugs. I received a note was forwarded to me, and a comment on the episode. And the person, I think, completely missed the target on what I was saying, but just in case there's a misinterpretation out there in the general public about what I'm talking about, I want to clarify something. I refer to addicts as victims. I insist over and over again, they are victims, and I absolutely 100% believe they are victims. The reason why they are victims, though, this particular writer seems to be under the impression that I'm talking about how they're victimized by the government, which there's certainly an argument for that. But it's more of a re-victimization by the government than it is actual initial victimization. Basically, the person stated that someone, the writer knew, benefited from being prosecuted. The mentioned person said that the person had been forced to finish school, got a welding certificate, basically bettered their life because they were prosecuted and sent through treatment, and the treatment actually worked for them. All beneficial, certainly. But the writer really missed the point. I mean, missed the point absolutely entirely. I could have been talking about bread, and she thinks I'm talking about biscuits. Bread and biscuits. Kind of similar in concept, but not the same thing. So let's go ahead a little bit and talk and explain what I'm talking about. Though there is certainly an argument, as I said, for re-victimization by government. It's not why addicts are victims. The reason they are victims is that they suffer from medical need. And just being victims or being in need of medical care should not be criminalized. Addicts suffer from mental states that make them harmful to themselves. It just is a fact. An addict, somebody who is lost to the addiction, are more harmful to themselves, and they're in defiance of their normal standard status of well-meaning care. They can't take care of themselves adequately because they convince themselves that what they are doing isn't harming them, when obviously it is. Their mental state cannot recognize the harm they are doing to themselves, or they justify the harm they are doing to themselves in order to fix their own perception of right and wrong in order to justify the harm. No one in their right mind chooses to commit the abuse against their bodies that addicts do. We're talking sores. We're talking, we're talking loss of teeth, calcium, heart disease, strokes, high blood pressure, low blood pressure, hypothermia, and hypothermia, where it's just the number of health concerns, and that has nothing even to do with the physical sicknesses they endure as they come down off the drugs. Between the sickness, the sores, the loss of teeth, vital organs, risks of stroke, heart attacks, etc., simply put, a sane person, someone who is in full control of their faculties, does not deliberately inflict harm upon themselves and lose concern over their own welfare as addicts do. Addicts lose the mental capacity to recognize the harm they cause to themselves and to others. These are people, and I cannot stress that enough. People, not criminals. They are people who have developed a sickness, and they deserve medical treatment. Now, true, the sickness is to a certain degree, and in many cases to a large degree, self-inflicted. But nevertheless, it is a sickness. It is a mental perception of harm. If you see somebody on the side of the street running into traffic, fighting illusionary monsters, obviously that person, well, in today's society, unfortunately, you're probably going to think they're high on drugs. But there are many reasons why people are suffering from hallucinations and delusions without that. But if you see somebody out there deliberately harming themselves, throwing themselves in traffic, fighting and running from imaginary demons, the logical process is this person isn't a criminal. This person is suffering from a mental disease and needs help. The government can come in, take that person, put them in observation. After observation, if the person is determined to be a harm or risk to themselves or others, they have the ability to commit them to a more permanent long-term care. That's the solution, ladies and gentlemen. Government has the power to hold someone for psychiatric evaluation for 48 to 72 hours, depending on the state. Government has the power to hold someone indefinitely if they deem during that observation period that they are at risk of harming themselves. If they're at risk of committing suicide, if they're at risk of throwing themselves off buildings because they think they can fly, if they think, attacking cars because they think they're demons. The bottom line is government has the power to see an addict and order their treatment without criminalizing them. These individuals are victims because they are suffering from a disease, from a sickness. It is not a genetic disease, it is not a disease carried by a virus, but it is a chemical-based disease that starts with the drug or alcohol or whatever substance they take that alters their perceptions and their ability to perceive the harm that they are causing themselves. Addicts clearly fall within this category. They clearly fall within the category where the government can see them as harming themselves and take steps to indoctrinate them or to commit them into a facility to where they can receive treatment and care. Proper treatment and care. None of this requires criminalization or prosecution. None of it. Zero. Nada. That's where the recriminalization comes in, and that's what this writer was talking about, was that she knew somebody who had actually been criminalized, gone through the process, and in the process of being criminalized and sentenced, he was forced through probably terms of his release to complete high school. He got himself a welding certificate, he improved his life, and went on into a better life. Fantastic. I'm not saying that the cookie cutter approach I've mentioned in the past is somehow completely ineffective. I said it doesn't work for the vast majority because it cookie cutters people into a mold that doesn't fit everybody. Obviously, there are people it does fit. There are people that will take advantage of it, who will take a system and say, okay, I realize the problem, I'm going to make myself better, and take advantage of the resources. But an addict who's not properly treated, who's not treated with cognitive counseling, is going to end up reoffending because their real needs, their underlying cause of their addiction has not been addressed. Addicts can be held for observation. If found at risk of harm for themselves, they can be committed, and the cost of treatment is significantly less than incarceration. Treatment does not vilify or make public the record of an addict's history. HIPAA laws prevent disclosure, so privacy is assured. So if you just get picked up for treatment, you're forced to do a facility to get treatment, it's medically sealed. It can't be shared. It's not available through a criminal background check. It's your medical history. It's confidential. It does not leave a searchable restriction on future jobs or rentals or anything else beyond the treatment. Only other doctors can find it. Criminal record follows anyone for the rest of their lives. So if an individual is prosecuted for falling victim to an addiction, that carries over them for the rest of their lives. Anytime they apply for a job, apply for a rental, they get any kind of a background check for anything, it'll show up. What's the reason? Seriously, if there's 87% of the drug-related offenses out there are possession alone, you're just taking people who are victims of a disease, victims of a sickness, criminalizing them, and then after you've criminalized them for the purposes of your prison for profit system, which is what I'm talking about tonight, then you turn around and maybe get them to the right treatment they need. Maybe. The state-ordered system is highly insufficient. More people return to addiction after they receive treatment in the state of Montana than get and stay on the straight and narrow. It's just a fact. It doesn't work because they're throwing a base cookie cutter approach that doesn't work for most of the addicts that they treat. And I say treat in a very loose term. The bottom line is that addicts are people who are in need of care, not persecution, and certainly not prosecution. That is what makes them victims, and that is why being persecuted and prosecuted before they receive any chance of treatment is simply wrong. It's taking people who cannot help themselves because of their addiction and making them criminals when they should be seen as victims of their disease, of their sickness. Agreed, again, it is self-inflicted at least at the outset. And certainly during the course of it, it can be argued that these are adults. I mean, I know many an addict who will make the argument they're an adult and they can take care of themselves and make their own decisions. Remember my analogy earlier, you see somebody running out in the street attacking cars because he thinks that, or running away from cars because he thinks they're demons, or somebody who tries to take a flying leap off a roof because he believes he can fly. Are these criminals? If they just suffer from mental instability, if they suffer from, say, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or some other element of hallucinogenic mental instability, does that make them criminals? Of course not. It makes them in need of medical care. So what's the difference about a drug-induced mental state as opposed to a natural occurring mental state? If they're both deficient states of mentality, if they're both states of, well, for lack of a better word, insanity, then why does one form deserve treatment and the other form not? And the argument is certainly being made by the writer who made the comment, who inspired this conversation, that this individual she knows did receive treatment after being criminalized. But the point is, why was the criminalization necessary? The reason is not because the person is a criminal, because the state wants money from the federal government. And once again, that's what we're talking about tonight. I mentioned the cookie cutter solutions because the cookie cutter solution only applies to a certain percentage of addicts. It does help, but more addicts return to their addiction than remain clean. I cannot speak for the writer's personal experience. I do not know what treatment program the person in their life received. I don't know if it was a straight state-run program or a private program. I cannot speak for whether they were reached through the program or how deep their addiction ran before they were incarcerated and run through the system. But if there's a success story, fantastic. I'm certainly not criticizing or claiming that success stories don't exist. I'm saying it doesn't address the vast majority of addicts. Obviously, it does affect and give benefit to some. It doesn't give benefit to all, and it should be more comprehensive, especially when the state-run programs don't incorporate cognitive therapy. They don't incorporate a safety net for the person after they get out of treatment. They don't provide any kind of social system that allows for a structure for the addict's life so they can regain their life or regain their independence. And they don't fall back upon depression and anxiety and loneliness and despair and fall back into their addiction. The question is, why do they even have to be prosecuted to get help? Why not simply make the treatment available without criminalizing it? And once again, that comes to tonight's subject. Sorry that was a little long-winded, but it does relate and tie into tonight's topic, which is, of course, as I mentioned, prison for profit. The term prison for profit is often seen as a term referencing privatization of prisons versus state-run facilities. But by applying it only to that small facet of the problem, it ignores the larger problem of states and local governments that benefit from the same scheme. The federal government gives billions of dollars to states and local governments for law enforcement and prison purposes every single year. Every single year, billions of dollars are passed down. The DOJ offers over $5 billion to states and local governments for various law enforcement and prison systems. The Department of Homeland Security gives even more to police departments. Department of Defense transfers hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment to police departments to aid in their war on drugs and their wars on enforcing and incarcerating and holding and detaining. Even the Department of Agriculture provided $360 million this last year to build jails in rural areas. Massive money made available from the federal government every single year just for meeting the criteria of advancing the criminalization, the over-criminalization of the justice system. The idea of the federal funding increase and criminalization and imprisonment can be traced all the way back in 1968. There was something in 1968 called the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. It was the first time the federal government really got involved and started offering incentives to local government to get involved and to advance with federal funding the expansion of law enforcement and prisons. It offered $400 million for law enforcement purposes. And I put law enforcement purposes in quotes on purpose because actually if you read the subtitle of the bill, that pretty much sums it up. The subtitle of the bill is an act to assist state and local governments in reducing the incidence of crime to increase the effectiveness, fairness, and coordination of law enforcement and criminal justice systems at all levels of government and for other purposes. That's actually the title. That last part is so generic, it literally can be for anything. It can be for buying paper clips to turn into shivs to stab prisoners through the bars. Not saying that's what's going on. I'm just saying it's so generic, it is literally so generic. It can be anything so long as it's done under the banner of law enforcement or the advancement of protecting society from criminals. It literally is so overbroad that it applies to any aspect of the justice system, whether it be police departments, jails, prisons, etc. By 1972, used with this as a framework and foundation, Nixon's administration announced having spent $1.5 billion, this is just 4 years later, $1.5 billion in state and local grants. State and local grants for what? Well, for advancing law enforcement without a real clear structure other than we're just giving money to states and local governments to advance the causes of law enforcement in all forms. This continued. Various different bills have popped up along the way. But then we had two pretty critical bills that kind of set the framework for everything going forward. It started with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Now, this was signed into law by Ronald Reagan. His wife, Nancy Reagan, is actually credited with the beginning of the war on drugs. She had no political power, no office, no nothing. She just liked making speeches, and one of her favorite topics was drugs. She wanted to declare war on drugs, and she got a pretty sizable voice behind her, enough to influence politicians and her husband, of course, to advance that agenda through government. Again, Nancy Reagan had no political power, but she had a voice, and she could compel people through her voice to believe. Once again, remember my topics on propaganda. This particular bill, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, dedicated over $1 billion to law enforcement, just blanketly law enforcement. $96.5 million of that was earmarked to build federal prisons. It expanded the use of the no-knock warrants, which were made pretty infamous this last year, as it was known for being responsible for the death of Breonna Taylor, who was killed by law enforcement doing a no-knock warrant while she was asleep in her home. Then we had the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, also known as the 1994 Crime Bill. This particular law was actually passed during an unprecedented decline in violent crime. And in fact, by the time the law actually took effect, between the time it was written and the time it was passed, law had violent crime had declined 16%. An unprecedented decline, and yet it was fueled by propaganda, the belief in the existence. With the advent of mass media, with news, everything else, we became much more conscious of it on a national scale, unaware that this has always been there, usually in higher percentages, but always been there, but we simply became more aware of it because of television and newspapers that now had these national connections through technology. So as technology increased, as information became more available, the general public became more aware. But becoming more aware did not necessarily mean that more crime was happening. But propaganda led to the perception of it. The Violent Crime Act, or the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, it mandated harsher penalties. It created the infamous three-strike policy of life imprisonment on third violent felonies. So if you get convicted of a third violent felony, it's life imprisonment. It's automatic in the federal system, and it encouraged that to be passed down to the states. It established a funding mechanism to reward states for sending people to prison for longer sentences. And all of this was dependent upon increasing the sentences for violent crime convictions and reducing parole eligibility. Violent offenders often now had to serve 85% of their time before they ever became eligible for parole, which, of course, early release never happened. Rehabilitation was no longer the target. They could not go to jail or prison, go through rehabilitation, indicate of a changed perception, and then be released on good behavior. There was no reward or incentive for good behavior if you automatically had to serve 85% of your time because your offense was considered violent. This particular aspect of this component made it very difficult for prisons to even release their inmates because now not only are they giving harsher sentences and longer sentences, but they're required to serve a greater percentage of those sentences, which meant that not only are there more people going into prison under the increased prosecutions as enforced by this bill, but now they're staying in prison even longer because prisons can't release them. They're stuck there. The Violent Offender Incarceration and Truth in Sentencing, TIS, incentive grant program, which is a part of this bill, offered $12.5 billion in grants to fund incarceration in the states. Nearly 50% of that particular money was for states that adopted truth in sentencing laws and scaled back parole. So roughly $6 billion of that $12.5 billion was specifically you had to pass truth in sentencing laws in the state legislature and cut back the eligibility of parole before you could even be eligible for it. You don't think states said, hey, wait a minute, $6 billion in free money? And all we have to do is just change our laws? What could we do with $6 billion? Well, obviously divided amongst 50 states, but nevertheless, understand this is a huge, huge windfall for the states. And this has not stopped. Every single year, Congress has budgeted for billions of dollars to continue to be pumped down through this system, to be channeled down to the states, to the local governments, to fund this war on crime, this necessity of mass incarceration, over-criminalization of the justice system that I've talked about so many times. The funding does not stop. Every legislative session, without exception, whether it be Democrats or Republicans running the show, they budget to give states and local governments billions of dollars in funds to continue to criminalize, over-prosecute, over-persecute, and pass longer and harsher sentences on individuals with less access to parole or early release. There's absolutely no rehabilitation incentive in this formula or this scheme. It is all based on money. And the longer they stay in, the more money the states get. But with the existence of these unprecedented funds for arrests and imprisonments, surprise, surprise, here comes the private industry. private prisons began to emerge. With the rising prison populations and the state budgets that exceeded the costs in annual budgets allocated by the states, not really knowing how to budget this, they're getting all this extra free money, but they're not putting it towards its proper purposes. They're obviously mismanaging it, or they're not simply not getting enough from it to allow for the amount of people that they're now incarcerating. The private industry stepped up. Now, for decades, the private industry had been acting as a source for services. They supplied the canteen, they supplied waste disposal, they provided all these different services for prisons that prisons didn't want to do themselves. So when Shelby County, Tennessee fell into a crisis and needed help, Correction Corp of America, CCA, now known as CoreCivic, in 1994, they stepped up and were awarded the first contract to run a jail in Shelby County, Tennessee. They later tried to actually take over the entire state's operating system for the cost of $200 million, and it was actually voted down, but they still made the grab. It certainly didn't slow down the private prison complex. Private companies continued to pursue operations and even built private prisons to get contracts from state and federal agencies to hold and detain prisoners. They fulfilled both state and federal contracts to hold inmates. CCA, for instance, owns or runs 65 correctional facilities, one of which is in Shelby, Montana. Both state and federal contracts are maintained by CCA. CCA has seen its profits soar over 500% in the last decade. 500%. That is a significant business model. Hey, my profits went up 500% in the last 10 years. Do you think people don't want to invest in that particular share? Of course they do. Surprise, surprise, Wall Street banks became the primary investors behind these corporations. There's roughly half a dozen major private prison companies in the U.S. right now. And they have everything from privately owned prisons to contracted services they run, or where they run state facilities or local jails or whatever. The point is, and they only take up about 8.6%, I believe is the statistic I saw earlier as I was reading through and preparing for tonight's episode. But that's still, where do you think all that money comes from? And where do you think the other 90% is going? It's going to the states and local governments. It's going to Flathead County, Montana. It's going to Helena, Montana, which is the state capital for anybody who doesn't realize that. It's going and empowering the local, state, and local governments to incentivize arrests, prosecutions, and detentions and incarcerations of individuals. All because they want that money flowing into the state from the federal grants. Federal grants have become money that actually becomes more discretionary once it gets into the hands of the actual state. The money does not go to actually confining these individuals. It goes to other aspects of local government or to state administration. It goes to pay the salaries of the law enforcement. It goes to pay for, whatever. But it does, a very small percentage of it actually goes to actually pay the actual direct costs of incarcerating inmates. Inmates in Montana are woefully undercared for. They have a woefully deprived health care system. I've lived through it. I can attest to it. It is draconian. It is a draconian system of incarceration to where the money is certainly not dedicated toward educational systems. It's not dedicated towards improvement or rehabilitation. You have, again, cookie-cutter formula classes that are put there for presentation purposes alone because they don't accomplish anything, or they accomplish very little. In fact, the only thing I've ever really seen these programs do is simply make criminals aware of what things to look out for when they're trying to avoid being caught. But all of this, whether it be the state and the local governments or whether it be the actual private prisons, is all fueled by the federal funding for increased prosecution, incarceration, and length of sentence as established and pushed down by the federal government onto the state level authorities. Now, for anyone who doesn't understand how this works, it's not supposed to work this way. We actually have what's called the sovereignty of the states, the separation of the federal government from the state governments. The federal government cannot compel the state government to make laws. It cannot say, we require you to pass this law and to enforce it and to stand behind it. That's why the incentivization was created. We will give you billions of dollars if you just change your laws to reflect what we want. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to professional bribery on a massive scale. The federal government bribed the states to do what the federal government wanted them to do. The states ceded their power and independence in exchange for money. They got bought out with blood money, really, because these states, and I can't speak for most of the other states because I haven't lived in the other states, but I have experienced it here in Montana. And remember, Montana government is heavily invested into mass incarceration for financial gain. I've talked about this in previous podcasts. As I've previously mentioned, Montana incarcerates 789 out of every 100,000 citizens. That is a higher percentage than any independent democratic country on earth. Let me clarify that. There is no country, including the United States, that has a higher percentage, per capita percentage, of incarcerated individuals than Montana. Not the United Kingdom, not any country in the world, not France, not Germany, nowhere on earth has more people incarcerated per capita than Montana. It's not because Montana has more crime. It's not because Montana is a haven for criminals and somehow the Montana government are champions of justice and rooting them out. If you believe that, you're believing the Kool-Aid and the propaganda that they're passing down. No, it's because they see money. And as I've mentioned in other videos, they rig the system to make it impossible for someone even accused of a crime to have a chance. There's no grand juries here. There's no probable cause determination hearing. There's no ability to challenge any evidence. You're arrested. You're put in pretrial detention under impossibly high bails that cannot be reached, cannot be obtained, which means they're detained pre-trial until they receive a trial. They lose their jobs, they lose their resources, they lose everything, they have all this leverage over them, and over 95% of prosecutions are settled through plea deals because of this undue influence that the government has over these individuals. Not because they're all guilty, but because they realize if they stay incarcerated, they lose their jobs. They lose their jobs. They lose them flat out. They lose their homes. They lose their lives because they're accused of a crime and they're held in pre-trial detention until they can get a trial. Okay? So what you're seeing here is a situation to where with all this massive money as an incentive, the government feels they can just take anyone off the street, charge them with any crime they want to, abuse their power to get undue influence over them, coerce them into incarceration, and so that they can themselves get more money. It's what it comes down to. It comes down to an issue to where this money fuels everything. It's the prison for profit system. And it's all motivated by the federal grants they receive. The bottom line is that Montana has not been targeting criminals. It's targeting numbers because it's getting rewarded for the numbers they put in prison. And if anyone else sees a problem with that, I don't know what to tell you. If you want to live in a totalitarian state, I can talk honestly. If you want to live in a totalitarian state, this is what you get. This is how you create it. use propaganda to hide it and make it look like a democracy, while in fact it's just a totalitarian state that's throwing enemies of the state or just common citizens into jail to get rewarded for it. It is what it is. I often tell people, we don't live in a democracy. We don't even live in a republic. We live in a totalitarian government. And they say, oh, no, we live in a democracy. I say, okay, very simple rule, very simple guideline. In a democracy, the government fears the people. In a totalitarian government, the people fear the government. Fair analogy, right? And everyone I ask says, oh, yeah, that's absolutely right. What is your initial response when a police officer pulls up behind you? Honestly, think about it for a moment. What is your first reaction? What is your first gut instinct when a police officer pulls up behind you? And if any of you cannot say the word panic, or you start checking to see if you've done something wrong, if your lights are on, you start running through your mind if they're going to stop you, because you are afraid of that officer. It doesn't matter if you're white, you're black, you're Chinese, if you're Martian. If you see a cop pull up behind you, your first reaction is fear. Maybe not debilitating fear to the point where you have a heart attack, but nevertheless, your first gut instinct is fear. Did I do something wrong? Am I doing something wrong? Are they going to pull me over? Am I going to get a ticket? Because you're afraid of them. You have an innate fear of government because government has an innate control over you, and you recognize your powerlessness to them. And if anybody listening to this can say they do not have that initial reaction, I would love to hear from them, because I would like to know what your reaction is. Unless, of course, you have some kind of an innate protection or shelter, like maybe you're part of the government and therefore you don't have to worry about it. Like if you're a police officer and you know another police officer is not going to pull you over, or if they do pull you over, they're not going to charge you with anything because police officers protect themselves. So let's exclude from that offer anybody who's actually part of government, or anybody who actually will automatically receive an umbrella protection from government. If you're a common citizen and you have a police officer pull up behind you, if you do not have an immediate reaction of fear, let me know. I'd like to hear what your first reaction is. I'm glad to talk about it. But at the end of the day, as far as I know and everyone I have talked to, and I've talked to lots of people using that exact same scenario, to a man, to a woman, they have all agreed that you're right. I'm afraid of the police officer. I'm afraid they're going to pull me over. I'm afraid I've done something wrong. I'm afraid I'm doing something wrong. That's the automatic human response, because you are afraid of your representative of government. The days of Andy Griffith and Barney Fife and, hey, Sheriff, how's it going, don't exist. They're gone. We have become a military state. And only propaganda prevents us from seeing it. And it's fueled by prison for profit. As always, thank you for listening. Once again, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're not watching this on YouTube, look for the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast on YouTube and like and subscribe. Obviously, if you want to go back to the original source where this comes from, it's monspiracy.podbean.com, and just subscribe there, follow me. Let's get some comments going. Let's get some communication. Let's get some dialogue. I'd love to have it. Obviously, please help support us. Send any contributions you can. The information to be attached in the information in the video. If it's not, again, go to YouTube or to Podbean. Either one will give you the information you need. And as I wrap up this video, I always end it with, whenever possible, please be safe. And as always, please be free. Thank you.